Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Okay, seems good. All right, looks like we're coming through. Hey, everybody. Time for another weekly live stream. Try to get into the habit of doing these more regularly. I know I might be coming through a little fuzzy here. I'm using a new setup to deal with the green screen and everything, and don't quite have it dialed in yet, so bear with me on that. But anyway, hey everybody, hope you're all doing well out there. Today, I wanted to get on just to ramble a little bit about some of my thoughts around the endocannabinoid system, this emerging concept called the Endocannabinoid Dome, which you may or may not be familiar with. And then I also would like to talk about kind of where some of the science is leading us, because certainly over the past 6 months or so, I've had a unique opportunity to get to talk to some of the main scientists responsible for coming up with this concept of the endocannabinoid system. And no, I don't mean Dr. Ethan Russo. I didn't know that this was a thing, but apparently a lot of people assign a lot of significance to Ethan Russo. And like a lot of people think that he came up with the endocannabinoid system, that he came up with the entourage effect, all those sorts of things, which that's not the case. Ethan Russo is a great guy. I've interviewed him, met him, he's an awesome person. And he's a great educator and has been very vocal about a lot of things, written a lot of great papers. And I think that's why there's been some conflation of those things. But actually, some of the folks that I'm talking about are people like Dr. Vincenzo DiMarzo, Dr. Raphael Meshulam, and then kind of in more modern research, David Meary. I've also had the opportunity to talk with Roger Pertwee over the email. And we were actually planning on doing a podcast interview, and he had a really unfortunate thing happen in his life that didn't make that possible. But anyway, I've had this unique opportunity over the past 6 months or so to talk to these researchers and try to wrap my head around what the endocannabinoid system is, what we know about it, what we don't know about it, and how their thoughts about the endocannabinoid system are changing. So these people that originally came up with this idea and have really popularized it, what are their thoughts on it? And so to provide you some context, so Dr. DiMarzo and Raphael Meshulam and their colleagues, there are tons of other people. These are people that get the most credit for a lot of these things, but there's always a ton of other scientists behind, the primary authors on a lot of these papers that get popular. But in 1998 is when you see some of the first research papers being published to really talk about in a distinct way the endocannabinoid system and the entourage effect. And at the time, so to paint a picture here, by the late 90s, the early 90s is when researchers discovered anandamide and 2-AG, so the endocannabinoids. Cannabinoid receptors were discovered in the 80s. So this was all very early on, like trying to piece together, like, how do we conceptualize what we've got with these cannabinoid receptors, these endogenous cannabinoids, and of course their enzymes and various mediators. And so this idea of the endocannabinoid system was proposed, and its functions were characterized as, and I may mess this up because I don't do any preparations for these live streams, but it was originally characterized as like eat, sleep, forget, protect, relax, some combination of those words, but basically saying, that the endocannabinoid system is responsible for helping you calm down, helping you sleep, helping, your immune system function, all those sorts of things. And a lot of the education that goes on around the endocannabinoid system is still largely focused on that information from 1998. But a lot has happened since then. And so basically you get into the early 2000s and you start to see much more sophisticated research around cannabinoids other than THC starting to be published, and particularly research around CBD. And this isn't to say that CBD research didn't start until the late 90s, early 2000s. It goes back to 1930s, 1940s. There was good research going on in the 60s, 70s. But it really started to kind of all come together in the early 2000s. And this is when we started to understand that CBD doesn't have much affinity for cannabinoid receptors, but it interacts with all these other receptor types. At the same time as that was going on, researchers were starting to understand that there are these compounds, generally these fatty acid derivatives, that are influencing the activities of endogenous cannabinoids at cannabinoid receptors. And this is where the entourage effect term really comes from. So in 1998, Dr. DiMarzo and colleagues published a paper reporting that they were seeing these interesting effects where endocannabinoids were behaving differently at cannabinoid receptors if they were in the presence of other compounds. And the key here is that not only was it present in the presence of these other compounds, but these other compounds didn't exhibit any activity on their own that could be measured in this experiment. So the original entourage effect was this idea that you essentially have molecules that have no activity at a receptor, but when administered in conjunction with other compounds, all of a sudden they either do have activity at that receptor or they're modifying activity at that receptor. This is a subtle difference from the sort of herbal synergy idea that the entourage effect gets conflated with today. This idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which is a very valid idea, but it's slightly different than what DiMarzo was really talking about. And so you start to see the early 2000s, the CBD research and this endocannabinoid system research to try to understand the entourage effect. And in that, we started to understand that, okay, there are a lot of compounds that the body makes that are now termed endocannabinoid congeners that in some ways are very similar to CBD. They don't have much affinity for cannabinoid receptors at all, but they have affinity usually for other receptor types that are commonly considered part of the endocannabinoid system, like vanilloid receptors or nuclear receptors. And they're modulating the activity of other cannabinoids. It was found that CBD modulates the effects of THC by probably primarily through allosteric modulation of the CB1 receptor. So binding to a secondary site on the CB1 receptor and changing the actual shape of the receptor so that when THC comes in, it has different activity. And likewise, some of these endocannabinoid congeners that our body makes, these fatty acid derivatives, are doing similar things. They're interacting with vanilloid receptors. They're possibly having allosteric modulation effects on cannabinoid receptors and that sort of thing. And so throughout the 2000s to 2010 or so, you start to see this expansion of the idea of the endocannabinoid system, and you start to see reports of, oh, now vanilloid receptors are part of the endocannabinoid system, or oh, now we're finding the CB3 and CB4 receptors, which usually when people are talking about that, they're talking about miscellaneous G protein coupled receptors like GPR55, GPR18, GPR 119, GPR35. There's all these miscellaneous what are called orphaned G protein coupled receptors, and they're considered orphaned because we don't know of an endogenous compound that associates with them. And so there's speculation, because a lot of cannabinoids interact with these miscellaneous G protein coupled receptors, there's speculation that we should consider some of these things cannabinoid receptors. Then we start finding out that cannabinoids actually interact with serotonin receptors quite a bit. And so then there's talk about, well, maybe serotonin's part of the endocannabinoid system too. And it just starts to get really complicated. And you start to see the endocannabinoid system evolving to where it overlaps with a ton of other things. The serotonergic systems, dopaminergic systems, there's a big debate about whether to classify endogenous cannabinoids as icosanoids. So icosanoids are a class of compounds your body makes, typically are pro-inflammatory compounds and anti-inflammatory compounds, but they're primarily associated with pro-inflammatory activity. They're made on demand when your body needs them. They act locally. They're broken down really, really fast. And they're derived from arachidonic acid, which is derived generally from linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid that you get in your diet. And likewise, 2-AG and anandamide and a lot of other endocannabinoids follow that same pathway. A lot of them are derived from arachidonic acid. They're produced locally on demand. They're broken down really fast. And so it would make sense to think of endocannabinoids as icosanoids. So then you have to start thinking about, okay, if endocannabinoids are icosanoids, what does that mean for the endocannabinoid system? And this all kind of intensified until around 2010 or so. There starts to be talk about this idea of the Endocannabinoid Dome, this larger, much more complex system that far exceeds the endocannabinoid system, that includes all of these different receptor types, non-cannabinoid receptor types, as well as things non-lipid endogenous cannabinoids. So we now know that some like chains of amino acids, these peptides, can also interact with cannabinoid receptors, which I'm not really going to go into it here. It's something I teach about in a college course on cannabinoid science that I teach. But basically, when you start talking about amino acid chains interacting with cannabinoid receptors, you're opening up a huge, huge area of research. I'll just leave it at that. It's really, really complicated and really crazy to start to think about endogenous cannabinoids as things that aren't even specifically lipids. So you get this idea that comes about called the Endocannabinoid Dome. And it turns out the endocannabinoid dome is linked to the human genome. Endogenous cannabinoids as well as phytocannabinoids can manipulate methylation patterns on DNA, so potentially causing epigenetic effects and changing, the genetic codes for certain cells and tissues and that sort of thing. So you have this overlap with the genome, and then through multiple pathways, both through effects on the genome, but also by manipulating enzymes, you start to have effects on the metabolome and the proteome, so the series of the complex patterns of proteins that your body makes and metabolic pathways and the enzymes that it makes. All of this stuff is interconnected. And my point in bringing all of this up is to try to inspire people to have a little more humility when talking about the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoid dome, and especially in the context of predicting therapeutic effects of cannabis or cannabinoid products. If someone is trying to tell you how something's going to affect your body and they're relying on old, late 1990s, early 2000s information about the endocannabinoid system, and they're only talking about cannabinoid receptors, 2-AG, anandamide, and, enzymes like fatty acidamide hydrolase and MAGL, then be kind, but also don't put too much stock in what those people are telling you, because these things are so immensely complex. We don't understand them, despite what a lot of marketing language may lead you to believe. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of things are interacting with cannabinoid receptors, vanilloid receptors, and what we consider the endocannabinoid system and the endocannabinoid dome. A ton of flavonoids that are found in a lot of different fruits and plants in general interact with the endocannabinoid system. Certain compounds, so there's a compound in turkey tail mushrooms, a certain type of polysaccharide that interacts with cannabinoid receptors. I mean, we're really just scratching the surface here in highlighting this physiological system in our bodies and how it's manipulated. And this is one reason why I say a lot in the podcast that all of the science is going to go far, far beyond cannabis. Cannabis is a starting point, and there will certainly be amazing innovations done with therapeutics with cannabis and phytocannabinoids. But the discovery of the endocannabinoid system and the endocannabinoid dome, and generally, I don't even like to talk about the endocannabinoid system that much anymore because it really doesn't make any sense to talk about outside of the endocannabinoid dome. But this discovery of those systems and the advancements of our understanding of those systems and how all of these different systems interconnect and work together, it's going to change the way we think about nutrition, existing medicines, and other plant medicines, everything. We're like stepping into a new age of understanding human physiology here. And in the 50th behind the scenes episode for the Curious About Cannabis podcast that just released recently, the video will make it to YouTube in the next couple weeks. But in that 50th episode, I talk about a discussion I had with Raphael Meshulam via email about some of these things. And he points out that, our understanding of the endocannabinoid system and the endocannabinoid dome, it certainly highlights interesting things about our physiology, but it also highlights interesting things about our psychology and what he referred to as molecular psychology, like the better understanding how what we call neurotransmitters, as well as, these bioactive lipids like endogenous cannabinoids, how they're manipulating our brains in such a way to produce some of the behaviors, thoughts, and ideas that we consider our personalities. So we have a long way to go. And so this live stream is mostly just, a cautionary tale to be careful about the hype that you read about the endocannabinoid system and recognize how complex it is. And don't let, so many people are rushing out to make all sorts of products to try to sell you, to tell you how cannabis or cannabinoids are going to influence some medical condition or make your life better. And maybe it will. I'm not saying it won't, but I'm saying be careful of these marketing messages and a lot of the education being put out there by people that are really just regurgitating really old information from the late 90s that's hardly even relevant today. When I asked Dr. DiMarzo about the Entourage effect, he was like, it's not even a mystery anymore because we kind of figured it out as far as how the Entourage effect was presented originally. And it has nothing to do with terpenes because they weren't talking about herbal cannabis when they brought up the Entourage effect. And on that note, go listen to my interview with Dr. DiMarzo. I talk about it all the time, but it's one of my favorite interviews I've done. But, he mentions that, like, how do you study the pharmacology of a complex matrix like an herbal medicine? It's extremely difficult. And because we know that compounds act differently when they're administered together versus when they're administered separately, it's probably not a good idea to rely on preclinical data on isolated terpenes and cannabinoids and things to try to predict what something like cannabis flower or cannabis extract or something is going to do to your body. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't support this idea of herbal synergy and the entourage effect and everything and then turn around and try to use really limited preclinical data on isolates to try to justify what you think your product might do for somebody. I think it's much better to just be humble, have some humility. I always recommend journaling. Keeping an experience journal is one of the best things you can do to try to find what works for you and your specific body, because everyone's biochemistry is a little different. Everyone's endocannabinoid dome is in a slightly different state. So, yeah, just be careful out there. Be careful the marketing messages you hear, the education stuff you hear. I try my best in the education work that I do to let you know, what we don't know, and leave it at that. So that's what we know, what we don't know. In a nutshell, I've just distilled an incredibly complex topic into a small bit of time here. But there's also a Curious About Cannabis episode about the Endocannabinoid Dome you can check out as well. I don't remember the episode number, but if you go to cacpodcast.com and search for Endocannabinoid Dome, you'll find it. So anyway, with that, I hope everyone's having a great week. And I look forward to catching you in the next live stream soon. If you have ideas of things that you think I should cover in the live streams, we don't have comments turned on the videos. We started to have problems with just trolls, and I don't have time to deal with that, so we just turned comments off. But in general, if you go to cacpodcast.com, you can send me messages there or catch us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And you can find Curious About Cannabis there. And yeah, hope you're all doing well. Stay curious and take it easy. Bye-bye.